He dismissed her in front of 43 people, not quietly, not privately, not with the mercy of a closed door. He did it in the center of a banquet hall in Seoul's Gangnam district, at a table set with black lacquer chopstick rests and crystal that caught the chandelier light like small fires, and the words he chose were 7 words long. His underboss, a man named Yoon Chae-won, leaned across the table afterward and said simply, "You just erased the woman who holds your roof up." Yoon did not look angry. He looked sorry for him. That is the detail that stayed. Not the cruelty itself, but the pity of the man watching it. This is the story of what Kang Dae-jung lost the night he decided his wife's body was a liability to his image, and what it cost him to understand that she had never once been what he thought she was. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? He was 41 years old that evening. He had spent 17 of those years building the Jongsim Group from a single money-lending corridor in Mapo into a sprawling informal empire that touched construction permitting, wholesale fish, logistics, private hospitality, and the quiet management of debt for men who could not borrow from banks. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made by a tailor in Apgujeong, who charged 2 million won for a fitting appointment alone. His hair was cut every 9 days. He moved through rooms with the practiced unhurriedness of a man who had never once had to open his own door, and the rooms responded accordingly. People shifted, conversations paused. Chairs angled toward him the way sunflowers track heat, not because they wanted to, but because it was what bodies did in the presence of that particular gravity. His wife, Kang Mire, born Oh Mire, had come to the table in a deep burgundy dress she had chosen herself. She was 38 years old. She was full-figured in a way that Seoul's banquet culture considered, in its most charitable interpretation, unconventional, and in its least charitable, a comment on the man beside her. She had learned to enter rooms with quiet assurance, the kind that comes not from being told you belong, but from deciding it for yourself somewhere along the way and never revisiting the question. She sat to Dae-jung's left that evening. She had reviewed the seating chart 2 days before the event and had repositioned 3 guests without being asked to prevent a confrontation between a creditor and a man who owed him money. Nobody knew she had done this. That was how she did most things. The moment came at the 3rd course. A distributor from Busan named Park Sung-gil, broad-shouldered, red-faced from the first 2 bottles of Baikeju, made a comment that was meant to be jovial and landed 3 degrees south of acceptable. He said something about the table being well-fed on all sides. He was looking at Miri when he said it. The table went briefly collectively still. Dae-jung felt the stillness. He made a calculation in the span of perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which a man could have chosen silence or deflection, or the simple act of laying his hand on his wife's forearm and moving the conversation forward. He chose instead to laugh, not loudly, precisely, a short, sharp exhalation through the nose that said, "Yes, you noticed. I have noticed too. We are men of discernment. We agree on this." And then he said, "She does enjoy the good life," and he said it in a register of gentle complaint. And 43 people heard it, and Murray heard it, and the crystal glasses held their light and did not flinch, and the evening continued. She did not cry at the table. She did not excuse herself. She ate the 4th course with the same attention she brought to everything. Asked the woman beside her a thoughtful question about her son's university placement, and listened to the answer with a kind of specific, unhurried focus that made people feel they had said something worth saying. Only Yoon Chae-won, sitting 4 seats down, watched her face and understood what was happening underneath it. He was the one who leaned to Dae-jung and delivered his 7-word assessment before the dessert arrived. Dae-jung received it, processed it, and filed it in the category of things Yoon said that were probably too idealistic for the practical world. He poured himself more soju and did not think about it again. That was a Thursday in late October. By the following Monday morning, the refrain that would eventually dismantle him had already begun to play, though he could not hear it yet. The refrain was a word, not a grand word. Not a power word from the vocabulary of men like him, not dominion or leverage or network. The word was simple. The word was attention. What Murray paid and what Dae-jung withheld. Attention. The truest currency in any empire, and the one he had stopped spending on her years before he performed his small cruelty in front of 43 witnesses. She was gone by Wednesday morning. He discovered it at 7:14 when he reached for his phone and found a message on the dining table instead, written on a plain note card in her measured, unhurried hand. It was 31 words. He counted them without meaning to, the way a man counts exits in a strange room. The note said, "I have given this 18 years of my complete attention. I need to find out what I am when I am not arranging things for someone who does not see me. Do not look for me before you understand why you should." That was all. No anger in it, no performance. Just 31 words that were more precise, more economical, and more devastating than anything he had said in 41 years. His first response was irritation. He stood in his kitchen in the gray morning light that came through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment on the 32nd floor, and he felt irritated. He had an advisory meeting at 9. He had 2 calls before that. The note was an inconvenience of timing. He set it back on the table, made his own coffee badly because he had never learned to work the machine she always operated, and decided she had gone to stay with her sister in Daejeon and would be back by the weekend, uncomfortable and ready to be reasonable. She was not at her sister's. He discovered this when he called the sister, whose name was Oh Jisoo, at 11 that morning, expecting to have a brief, slightly awkward exchange that ended with Jisoo promising to talk sense into her. Jisoo answered on the second ring. She said she had not seen Murray. She said it without hesitation, without the particular quality of pause that precedes a lie someone has prepared. She genuinely did not know where Murray was. And then Jisoo said, in the quiet, flat register of someone delivering a truth they have been waiting to deliver for a while, Dae-jung-si, she has been holding things together for you that you do not know the names of. I hope you learn them before they fall. She said goodbye politely and ended the call. He set the phone on his desk and looked at the Han River through his office window. The second call came the next day, Thursday. A man named Hwang Bai-eung-soo, who ran the wholesale logistics corridor that fed 17 restaurant chains in Seoul and Incheon, called at 8 in the morning and said, with the careful neutrality of a man who does not want conflict but will not pretend, that he had been reconsidering his arrangement with Jeong-sim. Hwang said a contact of his had flagged certain irregularities in the margin, reporting from the past 14 months. Hwang said he needed time to review. His voice was polite and immovable. Dae-jung asked who had flagged the irregularities. Hwang said, "I received the documentation anonymously, but it was detailed. I mean, thorough. The kind of thorough that comes from someone who kept records for a very long time." He hung up. Dae-jung sat with that for a moment. Thorough. The kind of thorough that comes from someone who kept records for a very long time. He thought about Mireille. He dismissed the thought. He told himself she did not have access to that level of operational data. He was wrong about that, but he did not know yet how wrong. The third call came Friday afternoon. A financier named Sim Yoon-ho, who handled the quiet refinancing arrangements for 3 of Jeong-sim's construction-adjacent holdings, called to say he was pausing his participation pending legal review. He was polite. He used the word review 4 times. He did not use the word irregularities, but Dae-jung heard it anyway, ringing underneath the politeness like a struck bell. 2 men in 2 days, both citing documentation, both using the language of accounting precision, rather than personal offense. This was not a coincidence. This was architecture. He called Yoon Chae-won. Yoon arrived at the office at 6 that evening, sat across the desk, and listened without interrupting while Dae-jung laid out the 2 calls. When Dae-jung finished, Yoon was quiet for 7 seconds. Then he said, "Is this about the banquet?" It was not a question. "Is Miri doing this?" That also was not a question. Dae-jung said he didn't know. Yoon said, "You should assume she is. And you should also assume she has been building toward it for longer than you can currently imagine." He stood up. He said, "I told you what she was to us. I told you at the table. I am not going to say it again." He left. Dae-jung sat in his empty office until the cleaning staff arrived, and then he sat there longer. He went home and walked through the apartment the way a man reads a crime scene, slowly touching surfaces, opening cupboards, sitting in chairs he had never sat in before. The apartment had 42 square meters of living space, more than he had ever consciously explored. There was a room, an actual room off the second hallway, that he had thought was storage. It was not storage. It had a desk in it, a real desk, with a banker's lamp and a filing system along 2 walls and a monitor that was dark and logged off. On the desk was a note card. He picked it up. It said, "This is where I worked. You never asked what I did in here. That is your answer." 6 words had been underlined. He did not immediately know what the 6 words meant. He would understand them later. He started at the filing system. She kept paper alongside digital, cross-referenced. The files were organized not by date, but by relationship, by person. Each person assigned a color-coded tab and an index card that summarized the nature of their connection to Jong Sim, the history of that connection, any points of tension, any loyalties she had assessed as conditional. 47 people represented in that room. He had known consciously the names of perhaps half of them. She had known all of them. She had known their children's names, their comfort foods, the names of their assistants, the dates their marriages had fractured or held, the things they were afraid of, and the things they wanted to be told. There was a tab for Hwang Bang-soo. There was a tab for Paul Ah. There was a tab marked simply with the letter C, green, sitting at the end of the second shelf. He pulled it. He stood in that room for a long time. He thought about the year Murray had come into his life. He had been 24. She had been 21. He was running a single collection operation in Mapo, 2 men under him, renting a desk in a back room above a stationery shop. She had been working in the accounting office 3 floors below in the same building, a legitimate business, payroll processing for small enterprises. He had borrowed a stapler from her office one afternoon, a thing so unremarkable it should not have mattered, and she had handed it to him and said, without preamble, "The man you work for is skimming from the collection pool. It's about 300,000 won a month, maybe more. I see the numbers because my firm processes his legitimate payroll and the ratios are wrong." She had not said this to impress him. She had said it because it was true, and she had noticed, and she seemed to find it strange that things which were true and noticeable should go unsaid. He had not known what to do with her. He had eventually known what to do with her, in the sense that he had brought her in, given her access, watched her make quiet miracles out of complicated human logistics, and married her when he realized that without her, the whole apparatus ran slower and hotter and with far more friction. He had married her, but he had not, at any point in the years that followed, thought clearly about the difference between using someone well and loving them completely. He had been grateful in the abstract way that men are grateful for weather that does not rain on their plans. He had never once sat down and asked her what she wanted from her life. Not once. In 17 years, He understood this, sitting at her desk in that room at 2 in the morning, and the understanding was not warm. He needed to follow the trail. He knew there was a trail. The note, the filing system, the withdrawals from Huang and Sim, all of it was constructed. She had left because she had to leave, because staying had become something she could no longer afford to do with her dignity intact, but she had also left in a way that was designed to teach him something if he was willing to learn it. The green tab marked C was the teaching device. Inside it were 7 sealed envelopes, each labeled with a city name, each also labeled with a name: Busan, Daegu; Incheon, Jeonju; Pohang, Gwangju; Daejeon. He went to Busan first because it was the city of Park Sung-gil, the man who had made the comment at the banquet, and he drove there himself 4 hours south, arriving at 10 in the morning at the address on the envelope, a small office above a dry goods warehouse where a woman named Bak Seonja, 62 years old, ran a trade mediation practice. She accepted him without surprise. He understood she had been told to expect him. She offered him tea, which he accepted, and for several minutes they sat in the ordinary way of a meeting that both participants know has weight. Then she said, "Your wife asked me to give you this when you came." She slid a sealed letter across the table. "She also asked me to tell you one thing from my own observation, because she said you might trust it more coming from a third party." She paused. "She said to tell you that she handled the Park Sung-gil situation herself. Afterward, not to protect her reputation, to protect yours, because she understood that if Sung-gil understood what he had done and you had not intervened, it would eventually cost you the southern supply chain. It would have cost you approximately 2.4 billion won over the following 3 years. She did not tell you she handled it. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She simply did it." Baek Seonja looked at him with the cool, accurate appraisal of a woman who has mediated a very large number of human disputes and formed clear views about which failures are forgivable. "She does not pre-decide what matters," the woman said. "She just pays attention." He opened the sealed letter on the drive back. Inside was a name, an address in Daegu, and a date. He went to Daegu the following week. The contact there was a semi-retired attorney named Cho Byung-min, 70 years old, precise as a calibration tool, who practiced out of a ground-floor office where the light came through frosted glass and fell across a room of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Chow had known Mireille for 11 years. He had known her first, Daejong discovered, through a legal dispute she had quietly resolved on behalf of 3 warehouse workers who had been undercompensated by a Jongsim Logistics subsidiary. She had not resolved it noisily. She had not gone to the press. She had identified the error, traced it to a mid-level manager who was padding his figures, compiled the documentation, and brought it to Cho, who had then facilitated a private settlement that made the 3 workers whole and prevented a labor tribunal inquiry that would have made the second page of a Seoul newspaper. Daejong had never known about the subsidiary problem. He had never known it had been resolved. "She protected the workers," Cho said, "because they could not protect themselves. She protected your enterprise because she believed in what it was supposed to be before it became about your image. She does these things in the order they matter, not in the order they benefit her." He slid Daejong an envelope and said, "Jeonju, a man named Lim Tai-soo. He runs a cooperative credit arrangement. He will expect you before Thursday." Daejong drove back to Seoul. He sat in traffic for 2 hours outside of Cheongju in the flat gray light of a November afternoon, and he thought about the word attention. He thought about 17 years. He did the arithmetic of 17 years in the way that men do arithmetic when they are afraid of what it adds up to. He thought about every conversation he could remember having with Mireille about something that was not operational. He came up with 4 across 17 years, 4 conversations in which he had asked her something about herself rather than something about the work. He sat in traffic and counted them on his fingers, and then he put his hands flat on the steering wheel and looked at the road. 4 conversations in 17 years. That sentence landed alone. He continued the trail, drove to Jeonju and found Lim Tae-soo, who was a cooperative credit manager and former auditor, an exact, unhurried man who had a habit of finishing his sentences a beat later than expected, as though he verified each word before releasing it. Lim told him about a period 3 years ago when a discrepancy in Youngsim's co-investment structure had attracted the quiet attention of a regional financial oversight committee. The kind of attention that, if left unmanaged, becomes an inquiry, and if an inquiry, then a disclosure, and if a disclosure, then the sort of newspaper coverage that ends arrangements with 37 separate partners who do not like their names in proximity to that kind of text. Myre had identified the discrepancy 6 weeks before anyone in the committee had acted on it. She had corrected it through a restructuring of 3 subsidiary classifications. She had done this by working every night for 4 weeks alone in that room, with the banker's lamp, while Dae-jung attended dinners and gave speeches at industry events and told journalists on 2 separate occasions that his success came from his discipline and his vision. He had meant both of those things. He had not been lying. He had simply never considered that discipline and vision without the quiet, meticulous architecture of the person who organized their consequences were performances looking for a stage. Lim Tae-soo gave him the next envelope. It sent him to Incheon, to Pohang, to Gwangju, each stop another custodian, each one more specific about what Myre had done and what Dae-jung had failed to see. By the time he reached Gwangju, the 6th stop, he was no longer experiencing the information as a catalog of his failures in the abstract. He was experiencing it as the texture of a specific, concrete grief. She had loved him by paying attention. He had consumed the love without seeing it. That was the wound. Not that she had left, that he had made her invisible for 18 years and mistaken her invisibility for stillness. The 6th envelope sent him back to Seoul, not to a new city, back to the original filing room in his apartment. There was a 2nd cabinet, a lower drawer, the kind with a small lock that he had not initially noticed, or had noticed and assumed contained records of no particular significance. He found the key taped to the underside of the desk, the way she always put things she expected him to find. Eventually, inside the drawer was a single binder, dark gray, his name on the cover in her handwriting. Underneath his name, in smaller letters, the name Lee Sang-jun. Lee Sang-jun had been Dae-jung's chief operations director for 9 years. He was 44, precise, controlled, never excitable, always present at the right moments. He had started as a junior logistics coordinator and had risen through Jongsim with a consistency that Dae-jung had attributed to competence and loyalty, 2 qualities he valued above nearly all others in the men around him. Lee had been the one who called Dae-jung the morning after Myre disappeared, to check in, to express concern, to offer to manage the day's operational contacts so that Dae-jung could focus. His voice had been measured and warm and exactly right. Dae-jung had been grateful. The binder told a different story. Myre had begun assembling the binder 14 months earlier. Not from suspicion, or not only from suspicion, but from a discrepancy in a logistics invoicing sequence that she had caught while cross-referencing 2 subsidiary account ledgers on a Tuesday night in September of the previous year. The discrepancy was small. 11 million won redirected through a dormant shell arrangement to a holding account that had no legitimate business activity. She had not confronted Lee. She had not told Dae-jung. She had begun, quietly, methodically, to build a record. Over the following 14 months, she had documented, with the specificity of a forensic accountant, the accumulation of 47 million won in misdirected funds, the establishment of 3 contacts between Lee and a competing logistics operator called Dashin Partners, the progressive sharing of client sensitivity information by Lee with Dashin, in what appeared to be a structured plan to strip Jong-sim's core logistics relationships and deliver them to Dashin in exchange for a senior directorship and an equity position. She had documented 6 of Jong-sim's 9 primary logistics, clients receiving overtures from Dashin in the 14 months of Lee's parallel operation. She had traced the contact pathway from Lee to a middle figure at Dashin to its principal, a man Dae-jung knew by reputation and had always assessed as a legitimate rival. She had protected the 3 lower-level Jong-sim employees whose livelihoods depended on the logistics corridor, the drivers and dispatchers and loading supervisors, who were not insiders, who would not have had any role in Lee's betrayal, and who would have been the first casualties when Dashin absorbed the accounts. She had structured her documentation so that those employees were specifically named, their exposure specifically mapped, their innocence specifically verifiable. This was not incidental. It was the point. She had left a separate note, a single page, at the front of the binder that said, "These people did nothing wrong. Whatever happens, make sure they are not the ones who pay for what Lee built." Dae-jung read the binder in 4 hours. When he finished, it was 3 in the morning and the apartment was entirely quiet, the Han River reflecting the city lights in long pale bands below the windows. He sat at the desk in her room with the binder in his lap and did not move for a long time. He called Yoon at 3:40 in the morning. Yoon answered on the first ring, which meant he had not been asleep, which meant he had been waiting. Dae-jung said, "Lee Sang-joon." Yoon was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "How long?" Dae-jung said, 14 months, maybe more." Yoon said, "She found it." Not a question. "Yes." Yoon said, "Did she lead you the whole architecture?" Dae-jung said yes. Yoon said, "Then she left you the solution too. Look at the back of the binder." He hung up. At the back of the binder was a tab section Dae-jung had not yet reached. It contained 5 documents, pre-drafted. A formal disclosure to Jong-sim's 3 primary creditor institutions, citing the irregularities with sufficient legal precision to trigger an automatic review under the financial oversight statutes applicable to commercial associations of Jong-sim's registered category. A formal complaint to the Seoul Regional Commercial Tribunal regarding the interference with contractual business relationships directed at Daishin Partners and naming Lee as the facilitating party. A separate statement, pre-signed by Mireille herself as a corporate officer of record, a designation she had held for 9 years, a fact Dae-jung had not thought about for approximately 8 of those years, confirming the authenticity of the documentation. A list of Jong-sim's 6 targeted clients, with a draft communication tailored to each, written in language that understood each client individually, their sensitivities, their histories, the specific arguments that would matter to them and not to others. And a final document, a single sheet, that said, "These will only work if you deliver them yourself, in person, to each client in the order listed, not through Yoon, not through anyone else. You. They will know the difference." He called his driver at 4 in the morning and said he needed to be in Incheon by 6:30. The client in Incheon was a distribution coordinator named Yoon Myung-ki, who had been with Jong-sim for 11 years and whose account Lee had been cultivating for Daishin for the past 6 months. Jung received Dae-jung at his office before business hours, which meant he had accepted the request because he was still in the ambiguous territory between loyalty and departure, and a direct call from the man himself, arriving at 6:30 in the morning, carried weight that a call from an intermediary never could. Dae-jung delivered the communication Mireille had written, then he went off script and did something she had not instructed him to do. He told Jung the truth about where the documentation had come from. He said his wife had spent 14 months protecting Jong-sim's people and Jong-sim's partners without being asked, without being thanked, while being publicly diminished, and that the intelligence he was now carrying was hers, not his. He said she thought enough of this relationship to document its protection before she had any reason to believe I would be the one delivering it. Jung looked at him across the desk with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something. He said he would stay. He said it plainly. Over 3 days, Dae-jung visited 5 of the 6 targeted clients. He used Murray's drafted communications as a foundation, and then, each time, he added the truth she had not told him to add because he found he could not stand behind her work and not name it. By the 3rd visit, the pattern was established, and by the 5th, he had received 3 formal written confirmations of continued partnership and 2 verbal commitments pending documentation. The formal disclosure to the creditor institutions triggered the review mechanism Mireille had anticipated. The review moved at the speed institutional reviews move, which is slower than urgency demands, but faster than the guilty party can neutralize, and it generated an independent audit process that Jung Sim's legal registry required Lee to cooperate with, which meant Lee could not quietly resign and walk across to Daishin without leaving a traceable exit. He tried to accelerate his timeline instead. When Dae-jung learned through Yoon's network, 2 days after the disclosures were filed, that Lee had called an emergency session of Jung Sim's internal advisory board for the following morning, claiming the right under the company's charter to request a confidence review of Dae-jung's operational leadership during a period of documented instability. He understood what Lee was doing. He was not running. He was moving laterally, trying to take the institution from inside, while Dae-jung was still managing the external consequences. The charter provision existed. It was technically valid. If enough of the advisory board's 7 members voted to initiate a formal review, it would freeze Dae-jung's operational authority for 30 days, during which Lee, with his 9 years of operational knowledge and his Daishin backing, could consolidate enough internal support to formalize a transition. He had until 9 the next morning. He called Yoon and told him not to contact the board members. Then he called each of them himself. 7 calls, made between 9 at night and midnight, to men he had not spoken to in months, in some cases over a year, because Mireille had always managed those relationships, because the board members trusted her maintenance of the connection, because she had attended to their concerns and remembered their situations and checked on them during the mundane intervals between official meetings when no agenda item required it. He made the calls. He did not pretend the relationships were warmer than he had made them. He said, plainly, to each of the 7 men, I have not been paying attention to this board with the seriousness you deserve. That is on me. I am calling you now because what is being proposed tomorrow is a maneuver, not a governance action, and I need you to understand what the evidence shows before you vote. He told each of them about Lee. He was specific. He cited the binder. He named Daishin. He named the amounts. He also said to each of them that he understood the source of the information was his wife, and that her name deserved to be attached to the protection of the institution she had maintained, while being ignored by the man who ran it. 4 of the 7 told him they would not support the confidence review. 2 told him they would need to see the documentation. 1 told him he had been waiting to see whether Dae-jung would do exactly what he had just done, which was make the call himself, and the doing of it was a sufficient answer. Lee Sang-jun arrived at the advisory board session the next morning to find 3 people present. The board secretary, Yoon Chae-won, and a representative from the Regional Commercial Tribunal's Compliance Division, who had received Jung Sim's formal disclosure the previous day, and whose presence was standard in these circumstances, which is to say required and immovable and thoroughly unmistakable in its implications. Lee was measured in the room. He was controlled and precise. He asked for the session to be postponed pending his own legal review. The board secretary said the quorum necessary for the confidence review had not been achieved and the session was therefore not convened. Lee sat for a moment in the posture of a man who is calculating whether a move exists. None did. He asked to speak with Dae-jung. Dae-jung, who was not in the room, who was by then in a car driving south, sent back a message to Yoon that said, "There is nothing to discuss before the review completes. The people in the logistics corridor did nothing wrong. Make sure your account of events reflects that." Yoon read it aloud. Lee left. He was located 6 days later at a service department in Suwon. having apparently believed that reduced circumstances would communicate contrition. They did not communicate contrition, they communicated exhaustion. The audit concluded 4 weeks after that, its findings consistent with Mary's documentation, the misdirected funds enumerated at 51 million won across 14 months, the roughly 4 million more than the binder's working estimate accounted for by transactions processed in the period between Mary's departure. Lee entered a negotiated resolution process. The 3 lower-level logistics employees named in Mary's protective documentation were formally cleared and retained. Daishin Partners received a cease and desist from the commercial tribunal. The principal of Daishin responded through lawyers, and then, when the lawyers' responses generated no traction, stopped responding. The 6 targeted clients, all 6, renewed their arrangements. 3 weeks after the audit concluded, Hwang Byung-soo called Dae-jung. He called him directly, not through a broker. He said the documentation review had concluded, the arrangement was sound, and he was ready to reconfirm. He said one more thing, not as a business matter, but apparently as a personal observation. He had decided it was worth making. He said, "Your wife called me 4 years ago when I was having a problem with a supplier that was going to cost me a significant relationship. She spent 2 weeks helping me untangle it. She did not tell me she was doing it through her connection to you. She did not use it to create a favor. She just fixed it. I thought you knew. I assume now that you did not." Dae-jung said, "I did not know." Hwang said, "Well, now you do." He confirmed the arrangement and ended the call. He found her through the 7th envelope, the one addressed to Daejin, which he had been holding since the Gwangju visit. He had not opened it during the crisis because she had, with her characteristic precision, labeled the 7th envelope on its back. "Not until the work is done. You will know when it is done." He had known, finishing the Hwang call, that it was done. The Daejin contact was her sister, Oh Jisoo, at a home address in a residential neighborhood of low houses and narrow streets where ginkgo trees had dropped their leaves across the pavement in flat yellow palms. Jisoo answered the door and looked at him for a long moment, the look of a woman deciding whether the person in front of her is the person she had been told to admit. She stepped aside without a word. Myre was in the back garden. She was sitting at a small table in the pale winter sun with a cup of something hot in both hands, wearing a cream sweater and no particular expression. She looked rested. She looked entirely quietly like herself, which was to say, like the person she was when she was not arranging someone else's world. And the quality of her stillness told him that this was not a performance of calm. She had genuinely rested. The 3 weeks had not diminished her. They had returned her to something. He sat down in the other garden chair, the one that had clearly been placed there in anticipation of this conversation, and he did not know how to begin it. She said, "Tell me what you found." He told her, all of it. He went through the binder, the custodians, the client visits, the board calls. Lee Sang-jun's lateral move and its failure, the audit, the resolution, the 3 logistics employees who were still employed and cleared, he did not rush it. He did not frame it as a report of his own competence. He told it as the story of her architecture, which it was when he finished. The garden was quiet for a long time. She said, "The workers. One question. Were they safe?" He said, "Yes, by name in the record. Ji, Young, Baek, Hyun, and Seojun, all 3 retained." He had memorized the names from her note before he filed the disclosure. He had made sure of them personally. She looked at him with the specific quality of assessment she had always directed at problems she was deciding how to classify. Then she said, "I did not leave to destroy anything. I want you to be clear on that." He said he understood. She said, "I left because I had paid complete attention to us for 7 years, and I needed to find out whether the thing I had been tending was real, or whether it was only real when it was useful." He said, "What did you find out?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I found out it depends on what you do next, not what you did in the past 3 weeks. What you do in the year after that, and the year after that. He said, that is fair. He meant it. He said, I need to tell you something publicly. Not in the same room as the 43 people, but in the same category of room. I said something in front of a room of people who matter to us. I need to correct it in front of a room of people who matter to us. She looked at him again with that particular steady appraisal. She said, you do not have to do that for me, he said. I am doing it for the record, not for theater, because the record is wrong and it should be corrected, and the correction should be as loud as the error. She said, all right, that was all she said. The occasion was a restructuring announcement. Jeong-sim made 6 weeks later, a formal gathering of the company's primary partners and associates. 71 people in a conference facility in Gangnam, with large windows and clean lines and no crystal to catch light and perform anything. Dae-jung stood at the front of the room and gave the operational summary of the preceding weeks, the audit, the resolution, the renewed partnerships, the terms of the restructuring. He was specific and clear. Then he said something he had not written down and had not shared with anyone in advance. He said, this institution is standing right now because of the work of one person, and I have spent 18 years not saying her name loudly enough, and I am saying it now, oh, Myrae, my wife. She built the intelligence that identified the threat. She built the relationships that held through it. She built the protections for the people who had no voice in any of this. I erased her in front of people like you in a room like this, and I was wrong. And the measure of how wrong I was is exactly the size of what we nearly lost. He paused. Her name is Mama to the people in our logistics corridor who have known her for years and trust her the way they trust no one else in this building. I understand now why. The room was quiet in the particular way of a room that has decided something. Several people were looking at Myrae, who was seated in the 3rd row, not at the front. Having declined the front row with a look that said she would not perform gratitude for someone finally telling the truth, she received the acknowledgement without theater. She looked at her husband with the specific appraisal she always brought to things she was deciding were real, held it for a long moment, and looked away toward the window, and the gray winter light of Seoul pressing itself against the glass. Months later, after the restructuring settled and the corridors reopened and 3 new partnership agreements had been signed over the following spring, a journalist from a business publication asked Dae-jung in a recorded conversation what he attributed the survival of Jeong-sim to during what the journalist called the crisis period. Dae-jung said, attention. Someone paid the kind of attention I should have been paying to the things that actually mattered for a very long time before I understood the difference. The journalist asked whether he could elaborate. He said, the difference between managing someone and actually seeing them, the difference between using competence and honoring it, the difference between building an image and building something real. He said, we are building something real now. We are not finished. We have not earned finished, but we are building. The journalist noted that this answer did not sound like the way King Dae-jung typically spoke, and Dae-jung said, no, it does not. I am working on that. He and Myrae did not resume the same arrangement they had sustained before. The room with the banker's lamp was still hers, still organized by her system, still the nerve center of the relational intelligence that kept the institution oriented, but the door was open now rather than closed, and twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, Dae-jung came and sat in the 2nd chair she had added to the room, the one she had placed there without explanation, and without being asked to explain. And they worked. not in parallel, the way they had before, each managing their portion of the empire without looking at the other's face, but together, him asking questions, her answering with the precision she always brought to things she had fully considered, him listening in the particular unhurried way he was learning to sustain. She was 39 now, he was 42. They had 18 years behind them, and whatever number of years ahead. She had told him she was not offering forgiveness as a completed thing. She was offering the chance to demonstrate, across time, whether the understanding he had arrived at in the crisis was a response to pressure or something genuinely structural. He had accepted that framing without negotiation, because it was correct, and because he understood finally that the acceptance of correct things on terms other than his own was not a diminishment. It was what the actual work looked like. The refrain that had begun in that banquet hall, in the warmth of chandeliers and the stillness of 43 witnesses and his 7-word cruelty, the refrain about attention had not ended. It had changed its register. It had become something he carried, not as an accusation, but as an instruction. Pay attention, not selectively, not transactionally, not in the direction of whatever returns the most to you. Attention to the specific, real, present person in the room. Attention as the truest expenditure of a life. Attention as the thing Myri had always known how to give, and the thing Dae-jung was. At 42 years old, beginning carefully and without shortcuts to learn. She had not pre-decided what he was. She had paid attention instead. That was what he was building toward, not the empire. That. And he was not close yet, but he was closer than he had been on a Thursday in late October when he laughed at a man's joke and chose his image over the woman beside him. And the choosing cost him everything that was real, and the getting it back cost him something more valuable still. It cost him the comfortable blindness of a man who had never been made to look. And the thing about attention, the actual thing, is that once you learn to pay it honestly, you cannot stop. The world becomes more than it was. It becomes what it always was, which is what Myri already knew in that room with the banker's lamp, in all those Tuesday evenings and Friday nights, while the rest of the world rearranged itself around a man who had not yet learned to see.